The idea of the serial killer has been a gripping subject for over a century, dating all the way back to the quote-unquote original serial killer, Jack the Ripper, killing women in the streets of London back in the late 1800s. A case that is yet to be solved. Stories of serial killers still heavily occupy the focus of many today, with a pipeline of serial killer-focused shows, movies, podcasts, or even, YouTube videos, always being able to feed the public demand. One would assume that serial killers lurk on every corner, or are some sort of epidemic sweeping the US. But that is where you would be wrong. A strange part about this obsession with American serial killers is that they were all serial killers of the past. Monsters who performed the vile acts decades ago. But where have the serial killers gone? And why do we rarely hear of new ones? Before we figure out where they went, where did they come from in the first place? Well, the first notable American serial killer was named Herman Mudgett, but would go on to be known better by his alias H.H. Holmes. Between the years of 1891 and 1894, he would travel around the nation performing various cons and forms of fraud, but more notably, the killings of dozens of people. The suspected number of victims is somewhere in the very narrow range of 20 to 200. And his story would be the first story of a serial killer to be widely publicized across the United States, after his confession and story were purchased for $10,000, roughly $250,000 in modern money, by the Hearst Company, who at the time was America's major media mogul. The Hearst Company would bring his gruesome story directly to the citizens of the United States, sensationalizing the methods of killing in his testimony to bring in readers across the nation. Whilst the Hearst Company collected massive profits from the story, the ordinary everyday people of the United States became terrified. Reporting on serial killers was not a new subject. Across the pond, stories of London's Jack the Ripper had been told as updates to an ongoing story. But the reports of H.H. Holmes was different. It was not news of an active crime, rather the story directly from the killer himself. Something that had not been tried before, yet had proven to the Hearst Company to be successful. None of this is to say that H.H. Holmes was truly the first serial killer in the United States either. A better phrasing of his description would rather be the first serial killer to be widely publicized. An important differentiation that seems to be a part of the core of our question. For the following few decades, there would continue to be an influx of serial killers, though the numbers of reported and captured killers in the decades remained fairly consistent. There would still be public fear of the serial killer, but the US population faced other problems, such as major wars, the Great Depression, the threat of nuclear destruction, just to name a few. With such massive issues at hand, public anxiety was not directed at the threat of serial killers. But as the wars ended, threats dissipated, and the economy boomed, there would also be a sudden boom in the number of serial killers. Between the 1950s and the 1960s, nearly 3 times the amount of serial killers would appear throughout the United States, but this number was still low compared to the following decade. In 1970, the quote, golden age of serial killers would kick off and hit its peak. Over the course of the decade, there would be a whopping 286 reported serial killers, with many of the US's most infamous killers being apprehended in this era, such as Ted Bundy and John Wayne Gacy. This number would start to decrease in the following decade and would continue a descent until the 2010s, where we would return once again to pre-1960s levels of killers and marking the end of the Golden Age. This now leads us to the question of, why were there so many serial killers over the span of the 70s until the 2000s? And better yet, there is no one definitive answer to this, but there are multiple theories. Some speculate that many of the serial killers developed the desire to perform these acts after facing abuse from World War II veteran parents, passing down generational trauma. It was reported that a majority of the killers started their, quote, career around the age of 28, which lined up perfectly with the killers being a part of the baby boom post-World War II. Others will say it's because of substances in the environment such as lead in gasoline causing hysteria, but neither of these claims have been deeply studied or proven true. The reason with the highest probability would be a combination of mass urbanization and a lack of police databases, with the latter being the most important note. People had started moving to massive cities from rural United States towns. They didn't know their neighbors. Most people had small circles of friends, and for the most part, everyone was a stranger. These factors created the perfect conditions for serial killers to have ample amounts of victims, which they did. To add to the perfect storm of evil, police lacked large-scale computerized databases in order to connect similar cases. In many situations, there were problems sharing evidence across county lines from different police stations within the same state, and there was close to no communication at a national level aside from the FBI. The 1980s sparked the beginning of the US crackdown on crime, which would last throughout the next few decades. During this period, the databases were rapidly updated and there were massive jumps in criminology. One of the most important would be the use of forensic and DNA databases to help identify perpetrators of crimes. Better records were kept of potential suspects, and collaborative efforts to catch serial killers between counties and even states increased vastly, speeding up the investigative process. As time went on and we now enter the modern day, serial killers, though still existing, are much less common a problem for communities. Police databases now have better access to investigative tools such as surveillance cameras, and today especially the use of cell phones. People are able to call for help, take videos, and killers are leaving a footprint no matter what they do on their cell activity. People are more informed of the dangers of killers and opt to carry self-defense tools such as pepper spray when venturing out alone. But I want to return to an aspect of the first serial killer, how Hearst publicized his story. The practice of publicizing serial killers to make profit would return in the 70s and 80s. Many trials for notable cases would be live broadcasted to audiences nationwide. Even decades after the crimes are committed, entertainment companies still produce movies and shows about notable killers from the 70s and 80s. The stories of these famous killers are owned in the same way that H.H. Holmes' story was. Peacock and NBC own the rights to John Wayne Gacy's story, and Netflix owns the right to Jeffrey Dahmer's story as some notable examples. As I've said before, serial killers still exist, but another reason we may feel that they don't is the lack of publication about them. There are communities online of those who still follow the cases of modern killers, existing largely in the true crime realm, but the stories are not pushed on the masses the way they once were. So there, in summary, is why we don't hear about serial killers as much anymore. Do you think it is morally wrong of companies to profit off stories of killers like that? Or think it's kind of weird that companies own the rights to these stories? Let me know what you think about that, because I do. Thanks! Bye-bye!